This is the first of 3 videos on the poet Alexander Pope. Pope was the major poet of the 18th century in England. He influenced many poets after him, and his fame persisted well into the next century. So he's very, very highly regarded. Talk a little bit about his life to begin this first video. Again, this is the first of 3. He was born in 1688 to Roman Catholic parents. Now, this is significant because Catholicism was technically illegal in England. It was the official church of state was the Anglican Church, which positioned the monarch as the head of the church rather than the Pope. And so Catholics were regarded with suspicion. They were treated as pretty much as second-class citizens. They could not hold public office, and there were all kinds of regulations on their lives. His father was a very prosperous linen merchant in London, but because of their Catholicism, Pope was prohibited from receiving a university education. So the fact that he became a poet, highly literate, trained in classical languages, is quite a remarkable feat. In 1700, when he was just about to enter his teenage years, there was a statute passed in London that forced all the Catholics out of the city. They could not come within, they couldn't reside within a 10-mile radius of the city. So Pope's family relocated to the village of Benfield near Windsor Forest, and Windsor Forest is the topic of one of Pope's earliest published poems, and the first one that we're reading in here. While living at Benfield as a teenager, Pope would read voraciously, but he also suffered from a disease called spinal tuberculosis, and this deformed his spine. It caused him to develop a hunch in the course of his life, and it stunted his growth. He only grew to be right around 4.5 feet tall, so he was a very small man. And he made lots of enemies later in life, and those enemies would use his size and physical deformity to torment him and ridicule him, oftentimes in very, very public and humiliating ways. In 1705, he befriends an older man named John Carroll. Carroll would be the dedicatee of Pope's later poem, The Rape of the Lock, which we're going to talk about in the second video. But Carroll was older, he was literary, he was well-connected, and he introduced Pope into the London literary world. And this is where he encountered the most important playwrights of the time, William Congreve and William Wycherley. He became acquainted with the magazinist Joseph Addison and another poet named William Walsh, and William Walsh doesn't get much read anymore, but Walsh was very, very instrumental in putting Pope in contact with a man named Jacob Tonson. Jacob Tonson was a book publisher, and he published popular anthologies of poetry by different folks, and these were called the poetical miscellanies, and there were a number of these editions of the miscellanies over the years. And William Walsh helped Pope get his first major poems, called the Pastorals, published in Tonson's miscellanies. That was in 1709, and this really, they were quite well received, and this really launched Pope's career as a poet. Around 1711, 1712, he forms a circle with another group of writers, the poets John Gay and Thomas Parnell. Both these poets are in the anthology that we're using in this class, but we're not going to be reading them this semester. But well-known poets. and the satirist Jonathan Swift, whom you may have heard of, and we will be reading Swift later in this semester. And then another man named John Arbuthnot, who was a bit of a Renaissance man, and he was a writer, a poet himself, and he was a doctor. He was the royal physician. He was the personal physician to the Queen Anne, and she would die just a few years later. No fault of Arbuthnot's, I don't think. But together, this group of people, Swift, Gay, Parnell, Arbuthnot, and Pope, they formed a literary society called the Scriblerus Club. And they published poetry together, but also during this time, Pope publishes the first version of the poem by which he's most well known today, and that would be The Rape of the Lock. And we will be talking more about that poem, The Rape of the Lock, in the second video. In 1715, he translated Homer's Iliad into heroic couplets. Almost all of Pope's poetry is written in couplets, iambic pentameter couplets. John Dryden started this. Dryden began popularizing the couplet towards the end of the 17th century. And I don't think Pope wrote much that wasn't in couplets. The Iliad was published in installments over the next 5 years or so, and eventually the success of this project would lead him to translate the Odyssey as well, Homer's other great epic, and that would be in 1725 and 26. And these books were published by subscription, so people would pay money in advance, and that would finance the publishing. But there was an enormous profit, and the proceeds allowed Pope to publish a very large suburban house called Twickenham on the River Thames, a little west of London, and quite beautiful, at least in that painting there. And Pope was financially quite successful, and because of that, I think in part, people envied his success and his wealth, and he made lots of enemies that way. And in certain ways, he didn't help himself in that regard. In 1725, he published an edition of Shakespeare. It's not a very good edition. I'll just say that it's different from what scholars of Shakespeare would want to see, because Pope, and he wasn't alone in doing this, Dryden did it as well, fixed Shakespeare, identified problems in his versification, or changed things around to make a little bit more sense in their view. Let's just say that Pope made some adjustments to Shakespeare's texts, and this was not well received by Shakespeare scholars, and one of those was a man named Louis Theobald, and he was particularly vicious in his attacks on Pope and his edition of Shakespeare. And he would go on, Theobald would publish one of the early faithful editions of Shakespeare in 1733, and the 18th century was a century of Shakespeare scholarship. Johnson and other scholars would continue to purify Shakespeare's texts over the course of the 18th century. But Pope would get his revenge on Louis Theobald, and he often got revenge on his enemies in his poems, and in particular his poem The Dunciad, the Book of Dunces, which we will talk about in just a moment. I'm going to change my slide here. A few years after his edition, there's another nice portrait of Pope. A few years after his edition of Shakespeare, he published the first version of the Dunciad, in which he attacks Theobald. And this book, we're going to read part of it later in the third. We'll talk about it in the third video. It's a mock heroic satire, and we'll talk a little bit more about this terminology later. But in this book, the Dunciad, he attacks his literary enemies, And he would continue to revise it over the years and change the names of some of the characters to target different people. And the final version of it would appear in 1743. What you see here on the right is the 1728 edition, and it's in 3 books. By 1743, it would expand to 4 books. The more enemies, the more room he needed, I guess. We'll talk more about the history of the Dunciad in the 3rd video. In 1731, the first of his so-called moral essays appears. This is the Epistle to Burlington, which you're reading now, and we'll talk more about this poem a little bit later in this video. The same with this one. In 1733, he publishes the first 3 epistles of an essay on man. The fourth epistle would come out in 1734. And again, we'll circle back around to an essay on man in a few minutes. 1735, he published the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. Remember, Arbuthnot was one of the original members, a founding member of the Scriblerus Club. And he also published this year the 4th, and I believe the last, of the moral essays of the characters of women, which is addressed to his closest friend, Martha Blount. That's her portrait there on the right, just a gorgeous portrait, actually. And he had known her since his teenage years in Benfield. They met there. And a lot of speculation about their relationship. They were never married, but when he died, he left her his entire estate. So an interesting relationship. And the only healthy female friendship that I'm aware of, that was close anyway in his lifetime. In 1744, Pope died at the age of 56, and by this point in his life, he was quite miserable. He suffered, because of his tuberculosis, chronic migraines and problems with his posture, just a lot of pain and suffering. And so one gets the sense from the way he talks about his life towards the end that his death was in some ways quite merciful. So let's talk about the 3 poems that you're reading right now. The first one is Windsor Forest. This is the earliest poem by Pope that we're going to read in here. Again, Windsor Forest is very close to the village of Benfield, where Pope spent his adolescent years. He completed an early version of the poem around 1707, when he was just 19 years old, but it wasn't published until after he'd made his London literary connections in 1713. And it has a dedication to his friend, George Granville, Lord Lansdowne, who was a minor playwright and poet himself, who was older and more established, and had built a reputation both as a writer and as a statesman. He was, in fact, Queen Anne's secretary at war when this poem was published. And he was instrumental in negotiating the Treaty of Utrecht that ended the War of the Spanish Succession that same year in 1713. And Pope alludes specifically to this event, to the signing of the treaty, with the lines, "At length great Anna said, let discord cease. She said, the world obeyed, and all was peace." That's lines 325 to 26 of Windsor Forest. So it was in this context, reading the poem in this context, we see that it's fundamentally a nationalist poem. We'll call it a panegyric, a poem of high praise on British history and military power. The influence of the ancient Roman poet Virgil is evident throughout Windsor Forest. The Latin epigraph at the beginning is from Virgil's 6th eclogue. The eclogues were a series of pastoral poems about shepherds and rustic life, the comforts of rustic life. And Virgil also influenced the composition of the pastorals that were published by Tonson in the Miscellanies. But in particular, Windsor Forest owes a lot to Virgil's Georgics, which is a poem in 4 books that celebrates Virgil's native Italian landscape. He was a Roman poet. And this includes a lengthy section in the 2nd book on trees. And it's a poem about the virtues and challenges of rural labor. He talks about beekeeping and animal husbandry and so forth. And it incorporates numerous references to local gods and mythological stories. Very, very well-known poem. And educated young men in the 18th century learned Virgil in school. It's just part of their education. So some things to think about as you read. Where do you see the influence of ancient poets like Virgil? Where does it appear? How does it surface? And what is it that Pope borrows from them? Where is Pope's nationalism evident in the poem? How does he use Windsor Forest as a symbol of British culture and power? And finally, is there any point where Pope turns inward and reflects on what the forest means to him? Remember, he spent time in this place as a young man. What does he have to say about that experience, if anything? So here's some questions for you to look for as you're reading and rereading Windsor Forest. We're going to move on to talk about the moral epistles, the moral essays. The first one in 1731 to Richard Boyle, the Earl of Burlington. So this is one of 4 verse epistles. There's the title page on the right. A verse epistle is simply a letter addressed to a specific individual. It may allude to personal details in their lives for the life of the writer, the life of the recipient of the letter. But these epistles often expand and incorporate larger themes, which is certainly the case with popes. So all 4 of them were written between 1731 and 1734. And Pope called them epistles to several persons, but eventually they came to be known as the moral essays. And he envisioned them as part of a larger project that was never fully realized, but that was also to include his poem Essay on Man, that would form a cohesive and comprehensive presentation of Pope's ethical beliefs, how the world works and what is right and what is wrong. So he had this grand vision of how all these epistles would work together. And the Essay on Man is itself a series of epistles. And we'll talk more about the Essay on Man in a moment. The term taste is important. And the term taste refers to one's capacity to perceive and respond to beauty. And the reason that is important is because the subtitle of this poem was originally Of Taste, but later was changed to Of False Taste, and then finally it was changed to Of the Use of Riches. And what Pope means by the use of riches is the proper use of riches and the relationship between wealth and the cultivation of beauty and taste. One's responsibility with money is to make sure that the world is full of beautiful things. So this poem introduces us to Pope's gifts as a satirist, that is, as a writer of satire. And satire is a didactic mode that uses irony to ridicule the follies, the vices, the foibles of targeted groups or individuals through sarcasm and exaggeration and ridicule. And he uses a little bit of satire in this epistle. The addressee, his name was Richard Boyle. He was a very wealthy and educated patron of art, music, literature, and especially of architecture, which he had studied in Italy. And on the title page of the poem, this is actually mentioned. He published an English translation of the Renaissance architect, very important Renaissance architect, Andrea Palladio. His translation was titled Designs of the Baths, Arches, Theaters, and Etc. of Ancient Rome. And this itself was a study of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius. Pope alludes to this work early in the poem, but also describes how easily and frequently rules of beauty and order can be corrupted. So again, there's taste and then there's false taste. And this is what you should be looking for as you're reading the poem. What are the qualities that make something beautiful? And what is the relationship exactly between taste and civic virtue? How does the exercise of taste, good taste, improve society? And on the other hand, what are the attributes of what Pope calls false taste? And how does Pope illustrate false taste, or you might say bad taste? So those are some questions for you to think about as you read the Epistle to Burlington. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about an essay on man. Pope composed it in 4 separate epistles. Each was addressed to his close friend and political ally, Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke, over the course of a year from February 1733 to January 1734. So around the same time he was composing his moral essays, he was writing the essay on man. The term essay, I didn't mention this before, but Samuel Johnson, we're going to talk about Johnson later this semester, but in his dictionary of the English language, he defined essay as follows. And I think it's a little different from what you might think of with the word essay. But I think this is how Pope was thinking. This is how Pope is using the word. A loose sally of the mind, an irregular indigested piece, not a regular and orderly composition. An essay. So it sounds less formal than what we think of as essays today. There's the title page, and there is Henry St. John Bolingbroke there on the left. Notice that the title page of one of the early editions of an essay on man actually says Epistles to a Friend. It doesn't identify Bolingbroke by name there. The essay is a philosophic poem, and it's the backbone of that larger project I was talking about that included the moral essays. It's a poem in which Pope reaches after fundamental truths about the human condition. I mean, remember, he was diseased. He suffered tremendously in his life, and I think he had to think about, how do I reconcile my suffering with God? I think that was a big question for Pope from a very, very early age, probably from his childhood. The moral scope of the poem, then, is strikingly Miltonic, to vindicate the ways of God to man. Remember, if you've read John Milton's Paradise Lost, it's a theodicy, and Milton makes the same case for writing Paradise Lost, to explain the ways of God to man. Pope also says, to expatiate free over all the scene of man, a mighty maze, but not without a plan. Not without a plan. So in other words, Pope intends to lay out and explain the divine order of the universe. Why are things the way they are? He wants to situate humanity's place within that universe and expound upon its ultimate wisdom, the wisdom of the plan, despite all of our suffering and limitations as human beings. Central to this idea of a plan is the idea of something called the great chain of being. Now, this is not something that Pope invented. It goes back to even classical times, but it starts with God at the top, and then you can follow the chain down through the hierarchies of the angels, of human beings. There's Adam and Eve in the middle, birds, fishes, animals, trees, and then hell down at the very bottom. And this idea that the universe is formed according to a plan and that it's a just plan is fundamental to the essay on man. And so some questions for you to think about as you read the poem is, where does Pope describe the great chain of being, and what threatens its stability? And finally, how should we respond to human limitations and suffering? What is our consolation for it? What makes it right? What makes us feel better? What makes us okay with it? The great questions, right? So that's the end of the first part. We'll have the second video next week on the Rape of the Lock and Eloisa to Abelard.